Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the Ranking Member Cantwell and Senator Markey, particularly as it relates to the Coast Guard bill. I think this is a very important piece of legislation. I do want to, one area where I think we might want to look at in the future, you know, on the Armed Services Committee, where many of us on this committee also sit, we mark up the National Defense Authorization Act each year, and that's an important piece of legislation, usually very bipartisan. And but the fifth members of the military are men and women in the Coast Guard who risk their lives for their fellow citizens as much as anyone else does in the military. Sometimes get forgotten, sometimes get left out. I think that's something we need to continue to focus on and maybe look at the opportunity for moving a Coast Guard bill every year like we move the NDAA, and maybe even start to bring them to the floor together like we do the MIRAD bill with the NDAA. I think there'd be a lot of bipartisan support for doing something like that, and it would show the respect that I think all the members of the Coast Guard deserve. I appreciate Senator Cantwell's strong comments about the Coast Guard bill and our interest in the Arctic. We are an Arctic nation because of Alaska, but the interests extend way beyond Alaska. As Senator Cantwell mentioned, they're commercial, they're transportation focused, they're infrastructure focused, environment, military, and yes, people. Fishing. In the Arctic. Fishing. The people, who happen to be my constituents, are the other major interests that we have. And so I think it's really encouraging to see both on this committee and the Armed Services Committee a clear awakening of some of our interests in a bipartisan way in the Arctic. I'm looking forward to working on this more. I'm looking forward to hosting the chairman in Alaska this work session to see our Coast Guard in action. I do want to mention some of the elements of the Coast Guard bill, Mr. Chairman. I was happy to lead the efforts on this bill in the Senate, and Alaskans certainly know the important work done by the U.S. Coast Guard. They stand as a first line of defense for rescue, crisis response, and I think when the Coast Guard members look at this bill, they're going to see a lot of focus on taking care of them. A couple provisions. During the most recent government shutdown, I think a lot of people were aware that the only members of the U.S. military who were literally putting their lives on the line every day alongside their brothers and sisters in the other services who weren't paid were the members of the Coast Guard. And that was completely unacceptable. This bill will make sure that there's a bipartisan solution that that will not happen again. If the other members of the military are serving during a shutdown and they're being paid, then so will the members of the U.S. Coast Guard. Unacceptable. And we are fixing that in this legislation. We're also focused on provisions to expand opportunities for family child care, the improvement of recruitment and retention of women serving in the Coast Guard, improving housing, increasing protections for survivors of sexual assault, review of health care access. There is a lot in this bill that shows that we are focused and care about the members of the Coast Guard. One issue, Mr. Chairman, that I just wanted to highlight that I'm hoping we can address. I know there was some reluctance to consider fisheries or other NOAA-related matters during consideration of this bill. There were some issues that we did get in, some that we didn't. I'm hopeful that this committee, we can work together on a package of fisheries and NOAA legislation in the near future. I know there's a lot of bipartisan support on this as well. But overall, I just want to thank the chairman and ranking member, Senator Markey again. It's a really important piece of legislation. Certainly important for my constituents, but very important for the entire U.S. Coast Guard and for the entire country. And I know you and your staffs both put a lot of effort and focus on it, so I want to thank the chairman and ranking member.